Well, today in our Bible reading plan, we are going to jump over to the book of Galatians. Now, we're not done with the book of Acts, but at this point, by Acts chapter 15 in our reading plan, I want to spend some time in the New Testament epistles. Now, an epistle is a letter. They were letters that were written, and what I've done in our reading plan is I've tried to put the letters roughly in chronological order. Okay, so remember, the book of Acts is a history book. It's all about the early church and how the early church got started. And right about at this point, before we go to Paul's second missionary journey, I want to jump into Galatians because it was a letter that he wrote back to the church on his first missionary journey. So remember, here's the picture of that first missionary journey. And in that area of Galatia, Antioch in Pisidia and Iconium and Lystra and Derbe, all of those towns there right in the middle, those are all cities in the region of Galatia. And so when Paul writes the letter of Galatians, he's actually writing it back to these churches that he had just visited. Now, probably he writes this shortly after he visits them. And the reason is because that a group had come through Galatia after he planted the churches in Acts 13. A group of what we would call the Judaizers. They said they were Christians, but their message wasn't really Christian, because what they taught was if you were a Gentile and you wanted to become a follower of Jesus, you had to become a Jew first. More specifically, they were saying you had to become circumcised because Jews were circumcised. You had to become circumcised, and that would be a mark that you're Jewish, which would be a mark that you could be a people of God and trust in Jesus. Now, I don't know if you understand what's going on there, but that is adding to the gospel message. The gospel message says there's only one way to be a child of God, and it's by trusting in Jesus for salvation. Baptism doesn't save you. Circumcision doesn't save you. None of that stuff saves you. But this was the early church, and they were still trying to wrap their minds around that. And so this group of Judaizers, this was a sect within Christianity that turns out it wasn't Christian after all. Now remember, this was a subject of Acts chapter 15, the council in Acts 15, which you just read. But this letter, back to Galatians chapter 1, this letter was written by Paul back to those churches in Galatia, and probably it was written even before the council, because Paul doesn't ever mention the council of Jerusalem in this letter. So that's why we think that this is probably written in between the time of Paul's first missionary journey and Acts chapter 15. But we're going to read it right here. Here's what it says. This letter is from Paul, an apostle. I was not appointed by any group of people or any human authority, but by Jesus Christ himself. Go back and read Acts 9. And by God the Father who raised Jesus from the dead. All the brothers and sisters here join me in sending this letter to the churches of Galatia. Okay, so there's his intro to all those churches in Galatia. I'll let you read this for yourself, but I want to focus on this section right here. It says, I'm shocked that you are turning away so soon from God who called you to himself through the loving mercy of Christ. Because remember, they had just received the gospel. Go back and read Acts 13, and they were all charged up about Jesus and the message of Jesus. And then Paul leaves, and these Judaizers come in and start confusing them with this other message saying, hey, Jesus is great and grace is great, but really you also need to be circumcised. So they were confused. He said, listen, if you believe that stuff, then you're following a different way that pretends to be the good news, but is not the good news at all. You are being fooled by those, he's talking about the Judaizers, who deliberately twist the truth concerning Christ. And you can read what he says. He's got some really strong words about them. He says, listen, don't believe them. Don't believe what they say, even if they hear from God, or they say they hear from God. Even if an angel comes to you, don't believe it, because God's message can't be changed. The truth is the truth. The gospel is for real. And that's what you're going to read there in that section. I want to just close with this last little section right here. In verse 11, Paul says, Dear brothers and sisters, I want you to understand that the gospel message, and gospel is another word for good news, the good news that I preach is not based on mere human reasoning. I received my message from no human source, and no one taught me. Instead, I received it by direct revelation from Jesus Christ. Now, he's talking about what happened starting in Acts 9, which you read a few days ago, when he met Jesus, and then Jesus spoke to him, and Jesus taught him. And as soon as Paul understood all that stuff, he started to share it and bring this message to the world. And so that is really the message of Galatians. We're going to read more about it in the next few chapters, but for now, you're ready to read Galatians chapter 1, and we'll see you tomorrow for chapter 2.